Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hardacre's Luck by C.L. Skelton, narrated by Justine Eyre. Chapter 1. The last passenger off the Molton bus was a tall young man carrying a single cheap buff suitcase which swung lightly from his hand, as if it were more than half empty. He was dressed in a sombre dark blue suit, which, being slightly short at both wrists and ankles, gave the impression of something second-hand, and he carried an army greatcoat over his other arm. He hesitated for a moment before stepping to the ground, as if he was uncertain yet that he had reached his destination. Then he descended the last step, one hand still resting on the dusty metal of the coach exterior. Almost reluctantly he released his grip and turned once around, swinging the suitcase easily. Then, like a homing bird, he set out with purposeful strides eastwards in the direction of the sea. The uncertainty he had shown in the bus station was gone now, and he made his way through the streets of the small seaside city with the assurance of a native. He turned a corner and felt, as he had known he would, a burst of sea-wet air and a sudden gust of salty November wind that cut through his clothing. He hesitated, then set the suitcase down and slipped the coat on over his suit, but left it swinging open as he walked, more quickly towards the waterfront. When he reached the broad promenade, he crossed to the stone wall facing the sea, set the case down once more, and stood leaning over the wall, his eyes on the darkening distance, where the lights of 2 fishing cables bobbed on the rough sea's surface like early stars. He stood there alone for half an hour, drinking in the remembered delight of the sea. It was getting dark when he at last turned away. The lights of the town were coming on, and he looked cheerful and warm. He was aware suddenly of the cold, and the need to find somewhere to stay. He was aware of hunger as well, and the startling necessity of finding a place to eat. He rubbed one long hand over the short stubble of his hair, as if uncertain how to go about the next move. For so long the necessities of life had been provided, an unthought-of part of the smooth order of the days. To have to seek them out was distinctly odd. Walking more slowly now, he set out along the seafront towards the harbour, the sound of the sea constant to his left, while overhead a huge grey-backed gull shadowed him, crying mournfully, hanging in the air above like a kite on a string. The young man turned to look at it, before it swept away in a widening arc towards Flamborough. Loneliness descended upon him as it departed, a loneliness as deep and physical as grief. He found the cafe at the harbour end of Queen Street. It was a small, dingy affair with tired black-and-white checked curtains, half shielding its windows, and dust and grime obscuring the rest. But its light shone out welcomingly onto the wet cobbles of the old street, and the tang of vinegar and hot oil drifted into the windy evening. The young man stopped, setting down his suitcase and studying the front of the building. He did not remember it, and yet it was clearly of considerable age, not something that could have sprung up in the 3 years of his absence. He felt in his inner pocket for his new wallet, and glanced within in the dim streetlight, counting the few bills carefully. He replaced the wallet and reached into his trouser pocket, withdrawing his small collection of silver. He counted that too, smiling wryly. 3 shillings and 6pence. He replaced it also carefully, picked up the case and crossed the road to the cafe. From the look of it, he wouldn't likely find anything cheaper, anyhow. Outside the door he stopped, looking up surprised, and a slow smile spread across his face, lighting his dark, somewhat sombre eyes. Across the doorway an ancient wooden board was fastened to the brick wall, and on it, in peeling painted letters, was written the name of the cafe. Or rather a name of the cafe, since the window boasted a painted sign of its own, proclaiming Charlie's Chips. But the name above the door, disused and weathered, said simply, Hardacre's. He reached up slowly and touched it with the tips of his fingers. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and steamy, smelling of oilskins and the fishy reek of sea gear, and the air was thick with tobacco smoke. There were several small square and round tables, mismatched in size and finish, their surfaces marked with cup stains and cigarette burns, All but one were occupied by clusters of men in fishermen's gear, smoking and talking. They all stopped for a brief moment as he entered, and eyes followed him as he walked uncertainly to the small counter at the far end of the room, where a woman in an apron stood by a large brass cash register, totting up a bill. He waited while she finished her transaction, and gradually the conversations recommenced. The young man sensed he was being discussed. He had ventured into one of those establishments whose customers were so regular and unvarying as to comprise virtually a private club. The woman, square-faced and unsmiling, handed him a stained, hand-printed menu from the limited fare of which he selected cod and chips and a pot of tea. She accepted his order and motioned to a solitary empty table beside the door to the kitchen. The young man sat, sliding his suitcase under the table, and swung open his heavy coat. He did not feel at home enough to take it off. While he waited for his meal, he looked around discreetly, so that the fisherman would not think him rudely curious. The room was shabby, the tiled floor grubby with boot marks. The upper walls were stained darkly yellow with years of smoke. The whole place was permeated with the stench of stale cooking oil. On the walls was a selection of seaside postcards of large-bosomed women and skinny men in preposterous situations, and a few fading framed photographs of the harbour, the priory, and the old town. Half covered over was an ancient poster, printed in red on deeply yellowed white. A Hardacre cafe welcomes the family. Below the lettering was a Victorian romantic watercolour scene of fanciful children on a fanciful long-ago shore. The young man studied it for a long while, and then turned away. When the aproned woman brought his order, a grease-sodden portion of fish surrounded by limp barricades of chips on a smeary plate, he interrupted her hasty place-laying by pointing to the poster. "Begging your pardon, but could you possibly tell me where that came from?" he said. The room stilled again, in response to his public school tones. "What, dear?" the woman said, not looking up. She used the word with tired, affectionless boredom. "The placard, the Hardacre Café placard," he said, pointing to it once more. She poured his tea for him, splashily, and looked up, vague eyes searching the wall. "Oh, that was always here, best I can recall," she said. She turned and was already making her way back to the kitchen when he stopped her again. "Is this a Hardacre Café, then?" he said. He was aware of the perversity of the question, in that he knew the answer and was asking it anyway, for reasons of his own. The woman stopped and looked queerly at him, perhaps in response to the faint note of displeasure in his voice. "Happen it were," she said. "Would it make any difference?" She was defensive, and he quickly said, gentling his tone with a small smile, "It might. Is it?" She shrugged, more defensive, and said, "It were a Hardacre Café when we bought." And then, hedging, "Mind, that were a while ago. My father ran it then." She turned and hastened to the kitchen door, leaving the young man alone with his thoughts and his cod and chips. He began to eat slowly, finding himself startlingly hungry, and yet repelled by the quality of the food and the atmosphere of his surroundings. From time to time he glanced at the poster with something like annoyance. On one glance, his eyes met those of a big, weather-beaten man, with straggles of greying, sandy hair plastered on his lined forehead, under his navy-blue knitted cap. The man, dressed in yellow oilskin trousers and deep-cuffed fisherman's boots, was conspicuous for having but one arm. His left sleeve ended in an amputee's metal hook. He said, without introduction, "Now you've done it. Crossed our Mabel, you have. Be a long time before you get a smile out of her again, lad." "Since when have you ever got one?" a companion of the fisherman asked, over the pipe he was trying to light. The young newcomer grinned, an engaging grin that won a responsive smile from the one-armed man in the blue cap. "Sorry about that. I really meant no offence. Just curious, actually." He was aware of the quality of his voice sounding distinctly out of place. "Curiosity killed the cat," the fisherman said. Then, glancing to the kitchen door, from whence a sound of running water and clanging pots indicated Mabel's preoccupation, he said in a lowered voice,
Aye, but you touched a sore point. Mabel might like to pretend that Hardacre sign's an accident, but we're no fools. Free bit of advertising, that is, and Mabel's not one for passing up anything free.
I don't understand, the young man said ingenuously.
No, reckon you wouldn't. Now, you wouldn't know about this, seeing as you don't belong here, he explained quickly. But time was when the name Hardacre over a cafe door meant something. Trippers used to come over from the West Riding and make for a Hardacre tea shop first off.
Why? Asked the young man, finishing the last of his chips.
You mean you never heard of Hardacre? The man with the pipe said. And how would he? The blue-hatted fisherman cut in at once. His sort wouldn't be eating in Hardacres in those days. Reckon he's too young anyhow, don't you? Been a long time since Sam Hardacre's day in the East Riding.
They discussed the young man pleasantly, as if he were not present.
You'll have heard of Sam Hardacre, though, the fisherman said then.
The young man nodded, sidestepping the question slightly.
He ran tea shops.
There was a pause. The fisherman leaned back in his chair.
Lad, in my father's day, he didn't just run tea shops. He pretty much run the East Riding. My, now, them's bygone days. He was a reeton, old Sam Hardacre. My grandfather knew him down Grimsby way. My grandfather had a good herring cobble, and he knew Sam when Sam was just a quayside gutty. That's where Hardacre money come from, you know. Started out selling roll mops at the race meets. Opened cafes then, like this one. Made a lot of money at it. Time went on, he got big, got into hotels, heard he got into railways too, but who knows? Men get big like that, they end up with a finger in every pie. Though I'll say for old Sam, he never changed much. Even when he was living in bloody Great House, down Driffield way, he still would come down to Grimsby and stand around Harbourside, chat to folk, like he always done. Was a good man, Sam Hardacre. Ran good, decent places too, not like this rubbish.
He waved a disdainful hand around the rudely decorated walls, mindful to keep one ear cocked towards the kitchen door and Mabel's domain.
There was a day families could count on a Hardacre place, everything neat as a pin, clean, fresh. He used to say his wife, old Mary Hardacre, herself used to come and check up on all his cafes, and if she found anything out of place, or a speck of dirt anywhere, she'd be down on her knees, scrubbing it up herself. Then old Sam would hear and there'd be hell to pay. He was a hard un to work for, but straight as a die. My, now, he'd turn in his grave if he could see this place, with his name yet hanging over the door, and our Mabel pretending she's not got round to taking it down in 40 years. Reckon there's still the odd country soul comes into town is fooled yet, and if there's one penny left to be fooled out of someone, our Mabel will have it.
He laughed, swigging at his tea, but the young man didn't laugh with him.
Of course, the man with the pipe put in. There aren't any real Hardacre cafes left. Old Sam pulled out just after the war, the first one. Went into other things, I suppose, and his son Joe were a different kettle of fish. A different kettle of fish entirely.
The first fisherman nodded sagely in agreement.
Aye, he said. Joe Hardacre. There was a great bastard if there ever was one. Opened sweatshops all over the place, till his own father had to come and close 'em down. Ran off to America then, and got himself in so much trouble he ended up jumping out a window. Pretty funny how life is. Two like that into one family. Still, it's a way of things. Aye, the pipe smoker laughed. Where there's muck, there's brass, and on t'other hand, where there's brass, there's muck.
They both laughed. The young man did not join in the laughter. He finished his meal solemnly and laid his knife and fork carefully down with an orderliness that defied the casual clutter of the table with its ketchup stains and sticky-necked bottles of fruit sauce and vinegar. Before he finished his tea, a process he was dragging out to allow himself a little longer in the sheltered warmth, he turned around in his chair and addressed the two fishermen who had spoken.
I wonder if you gentlemen could give me some advice.
He was aware of the sideways glances from the other denizens of the cafe, as if any advice given must first be vetted by the entire company.
"Happen we could," said the man in the blue cap. "If it were the sort of thing we'd know anything about."
He said it with a mixture of reserve and modesty that signalled to the young stranger that he might just be overstepping the bounds.
"Thank you," he said carefully. "There are two things, actually. I am needing a place to stay for a while. That's the first."
He paused, judging himself wiser to obtain the first answer before venturing the second query.
"Happen you're at the wrong end of town," the fisherman said slowly, tugging at one weather-reddened ear. "Hotels of the sort you be wanting are all up t'other end. Mine, there's the station just up the road, but I don't reckon you'd go much on't."
He shook his head, and his companion nodded sagely.
"Actually," the young man said, "I wasn't thinking in terms of a hotel. Something more permanent. A guest house, a boarding house, really."
He paused, and then said quickly,
"Something a little less dear."
There was a silence as the room took in this admission of financial insecurity, and the blue-capped fisherman appeared to be assessing it, uncertain whether he would choose to believe it.
"Something less dear,"
he said at last, to be sure he heard right. The young man nodded and gave one of his bright grins, which, on this occasion, won no response. The two fishermen whispered a moment together.
"Reckon Jean Hewitt might have a room. Plain enough there, anyhow."
They were talking, still to each other. A nod passed between them. The first fisherman again addressed the newcomer.
"Place up St. Hilda Street, Jean Hewitt might do. Food's good, tariffs fair enough. Jean's a good sort underneath. Mind you, takes a while to get underneath. Still, in all, her bark's worse than her bite. Jean Hewitt might do you. You're sure now, though, you'd not rather a hotel?"
he added uncertainly.
"Quite certain," the young man said with another smile. "I'll try Mrs. Hewitt right now."
They nodded, and one said,
"It's number 8. Will I show you how to find it?"
The young stranger shook his head.
"I'll find it," he said.
He rose to his feet, wondering if he'd asked enough questions for one night. He imagined he probably had, but time was pressing.
"And the other thing," he added, "I'm looking for work. Do you know of anything going?" "Work," they said together. "You meaning a job?" "Yes, work, a job."
He grinned in spite of himself, wondering how they imagined people like himself to live.
"Oh, no, lad. There's nothing of the kind of work your sort would want round here. Just the harbour and the fishing and the arcades and cafes down this end. Nothing for your sort."
The young man nodded. He'd have to find that answer on his own, it was clear.
"Thank you anyhow," he said. "I'll look around." "You won't find anything down this end," they said again.
He smiled, and as the venerable Mabel came, brows lowering through the door, he reached into his trouser pocket for his 3 and 6pence, and paid out the 1 shilling and 3pence for his meal. She took it, unsmiling, and rang up the cash register.
"Excuse me," he said. That placard," he said.
"Now what about that placard?" she said with strained good nature.
"I want it," the young man said.
"You want the placard now?" she repeated after him.
"Yes. What do you want for it?"
There was a moment's confused silence. "For the placard," she said. "What do I want? Look, lad, I don't sell placards. What would I be selling that for?"
"Because I want it. And the sign outside. How much for the pair?"
She stood with her rouged face impassive, but for her lowering, red-painted bottom lip. The young man was conscious of the listening ears at the tables all around. He would have to make the next move, for Mabel would no doubt stand there with lowered jaw forever. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew his wallet, a gesture that aroused a murmur of curiosity from the attentive room. Thinking quickly, with rash impulse, he withdrew a note and extended it, ostentatiously large, to the woman. £5, she exclaimed. "For that thing?" Her voice rose to a shriek of amazement, and there was a quick muttering about the room.
"A deal, then," he said quickly.
"Sure," she said, "if you're as mad as that." She took the proffered note quickly. "And here's hoping there's more where you come from." She laughed disdainfully and waved a hand towards the faded advertisement.
"Take it, lad, it's yarn."
"And the sign," he pursued. "The sign as well."
"Take them both," she said,
laughing to herself as she folded the large note.
£5 for that rubbish," she muttered again,
her voice echoing delight at her bargain and genuine disgust at his foolishness.
"Splendid," said the young man.
He strode across the room, suddenly lithe and athletic, and wrenched the tattered card from the wall. He tucked it under his arm and walked to the door, turning to salute the fisherman with a grin. Then he went out into the wet darkness, and, with a sound that was audible within the cafe itself, he reached strong young arms to the old wooden sign and tore it from its mountings on the wall. Then he tucked the sign, too, under his arm and strode, laughing, into the windy night. The moment the door closed behind the young man, the attentions of the room, hitherto discreet and diverse, came to a sudden focus on his empty chair. There was a brief silence, in which eyes wandered from the chair to the one-armed fisherman in the blue cap, who had become, suddenly, an authority.
"Well, now,"
said a fat, cheerful man in a thick-knit grey jumper, who had until now been apparently unaware of the whole event.
"What's to make of that?"
"Rate queer, if you ask me," answered the pipe-smoker. He tapped ash into a cheap metal ashtray and looked to the man in the navy-blue hat. Mabel intervened.
"Daft," she said,
still showing her disgust.
"Got more money than sense and playing daft with it. Imagine putting out £5 for rubbish like that."
She sniffed, slipping the note into the bottom tray of the brass register.
"Rubbish or not, you seemed happy enough to sell it,"
the man in the blue hat said over his cup of tea. Mabel sniffed, slammed the drawer shut, and retired through the battered door to the kitchen. Immediately the conversation in the room brightened and spread to include all aspects of the young stranger, his appearance, his manner, his accent.
"Now, what do you make of that?" one said. "First he wants a rooming house, and a cheap one at that. Then he wants work on to fish quay. Then he flings fivers about like they're going out of style." "A fool on his money are soon parted," said the pipe-smoker.
"Aye, well, but if you ask me, there's more to it than that. He had a great peculiar look about him, that one. Clothes that didn't fit right and a mouthful of marbles."
"Actually, I need some advice, gentlemen," the speaker mimicked. "I reckon he's a proper spiv, that one. Up to no good, anyhow."
"Seemed pleasant enough," said the blue-hatted fisherman. He tapped the table with his one hand. The artificial one hung down at his side. The disability, the result of a savage encounter with a winch-line, had cost him his working life, and he was ashamed of it and strove hard to keep it from showing. He was a thoughtful man, inclined not to judge others harshly, and he didn't like the way the conversation was going.
"Aye," his pipe-smoking companion said. "He would be that, wouldn't he? I'll tell you something I noticed. See the cut of his hair? Right well shaved off, nay, but a stubble it were that short. Now I can think of just about one place where a man gets his hair cut like that."
"Might be just out of the forces," someone put in, but he was countered easily by the pipe-smoker.
"War's been over near enough 5 years. Them that was getting out are all out long since. There was a time I'd have thought the same, mind. They had that look a bit. Mind how it was in '46, every third lad blinking about wide-eyed in a D-mob suit, looking for work. Nay, not now. And I wager he's no professional just bought himself out, either. You can tell them a mile off, all spit and polish even in their civvies. Nay, boys, I know right off where he's been last year or two."
"And where would that be?" asked his companion, his eyes on his artificial hand.
"Been inside."
The fat man at the next table nodded sagely, and around the cafe there was a general murmur of interested agreement.
"I'd put money on it," the pipe-smoker said, warming to his theme. "And what's more, he's no ordinary bloke got himself in a bit of trouble with the law. Yon's a proper tough, son of some big family gone bad. Worst kind you can get," he added darkly.
"Nay, Mabel," he said to the sour-faced hostess who had reappeared at her doorway to listen.
You'd be wise to give that one short shrift if he shows face around here again. Bloody rubbish.
The pipe smoker looked up from his discourse, surprised. His companion got clumsily to his feet, his false arm swinging loose. Painstakingly he thrust it through the sleeve of his yellow oilskin jacket that had hung over his chair back, and roughly pulled the jacket on.
Of all the bloody presumptuous twaddle, you don't none of you know from anything a damn thing about the lad, and you've well nigh got him tarred and feathered. As for Mabel's placard, well, I'd pay a tenner myself to see the whole damned place stripped of all that rubbish and scrubbed clean. And you needn't look offended, woman. The place is a damn disgrace. If lad shows up again, it'll be his own misfortune, nay, yarn. I'm off, anyway. Happen I'd rather talk with gulls.
He stalked out into the night, leaving a chastened silence behind. Once outside, he turned on his heel abruptly and made off with a still angry stride towards St. Hilda Street. He walked quickly, cradling his bad arm against his chest as he did when he was in a hurry, and, as he expected, he caught sight of the young man with the suitcase before the latter had achieved his destination.
"Oi, lad!" he shouted into the wind. "Hold on a moment."
The young man hesitated, looking round, and the old fisherman tried not to let himself read an undercurrent of edginess into the action. He lengthened his stride and caught up with the man with the suitcase at the corner of St. Hilda Street.
"Sir," the other said, politely questioning.
The fisherman was amused by the formality, but said only,
"Summat come to mind soon as you were gone, lad. Job of work needing doing. Mind now Queen Street, where we was."
He pointed back into the rainy night.
"Yes," the young man answered, also peering into the darkness. "Well, if you go harbourwards 3 or 4 shops, and then across the street there's another chip shop, newer place, run by West Riding folk, come over last year. Recollect now their lass, who was always behind the counter, up and got herself married last week and left the place. Know for a fact they'll be needing a hand there, and if you'd not mind a bit of fish frying, mind now the wages can't be much, not when they're used to having family labour on the cheap."
He looked doubtful, cocking his head to one side and studying the well-spoken young stranger in the wet streetlight, still uncertain what he was doing here. The young man's face broke into one of his broad grins, and his dark eyes crinkled at the corners.
"I dare say I could fry fish with the best of them," he said,
laughing at some private joke.
"That's capital of you, sir. I can't say how grateful I am."
He glanced across the street at the friendly light of a pub with a ship's wheel motif on the hanging sign above the door.
"Could I stand you a drink, sir?"
The fisherman hesitated, and then, catching sight of the old Hardacre sign still under the other's arm, he tapped it lightly and said,
"Nay, lad, hang on to your brass. You've spread enough about for one night."
He turned to go, and then stopped and pointed up the road.
"Yon's Mrs. Hewitt, number 8,
he said, indicating a tall, narrow-fronted building with a tiny garden edged by a low brick wall.
"You can tell her Mick Radley sent you, for what it's worth."
He turned and lumbered off, his gait uneven, with the bad arm slung across his chest and his head bent towards the sea wind. Mrs. Hewitt proved to be a tall, thin body, whose air of cultured haughtiness appeared a professional stance. Like the woven mat that said welcome on her scrubbed doorstep, and the white lace half-curtains on her windows, it was part of the role.
"Yes,"
she said, narrowing the vowel delicately.
"Can I help you?"
"I was looking for a room," he said, adding quickly, "Mr. Radley suggested I try her."
"Mr. Radley?"
"Mick Radley. He said I should say—"
"Indeed."
She eyed him as frostily as ever, but something in her voice had softened.
"I'm very much afraid my best rooms are all taken. I'm much in demand, you know. However, we might be able to find you a small accommodation, for a week, while we get to know each other," she added darkly. "Then we shall reassess."
"A week would do splendidly,"
he assured her rapidly, lifting his suitcase as she stepped backwards into the hallway to let him in. He was still carrying the sign, and tried now to conceal it against the sleeve of his greatcoat, knowing it would be difficult to explain. She led him up 2 flights of narrow, dark stairs, hung at fiercely regular intervals with small, sentimental seaside prints. At the second
Sample complete. Ready to continue?